First is April Fool's Day. Psalms 14:1 states, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." Thus, it is the opinion of this court that if your client says there is no God, then he is a fool. Therefore, April 1st is his day. Court is adjourned. You gotta love that judge that knows his scriptures.
So, this is to educate you on Easter, okay? On Easter bunnies, just on Easter bunnies. So, what is an Easter bunny's favorite place to eat? IHOP. IHOP? What is a bunny's favorite music they like? Hip hop. What is a bunny's favorite state capital? Of all the capitals in the United States, what's their favorite?
Sacramento.
Albany, New York. Albany. What comes at the end of Easter? What comes at the very end of Easter?
Resurrection.
The letter R. Yeah, you got it, okay. That's my contributions.
Pipe Spring is a fort constructed of two-story buildings facing each other with a courtyard in between. It was constructed with gates on both ends, allowing wagons to be brought in for protection. It also has two small buildings located, one to the west and one to the east. The fort is situated over a spring on the point of the Vermilion Cliffs, giving view to the south, east, and west for up to 50 miles. The National Monument is situated within the Kaibab Indian Reservation, consisting of 40 acres. According to archaeologists, archaeological studies, the Southern Paiute Indians occupied this place beginning about 1100 AD. Prior to the arrival of the Europeans in North America, small bands of semi-sedentary people gathered the natural plants and hunted this region. Pine nuts were especially valued as a dietary supplement. The Southern Paiutes practiced small horticulture, planting and irrigating crops of corn, beans, squash, and squash near permanent water sources. There was in this area 3 major springs and several washes containing smaller water sources. The Spanish explorers were the first to make contact in this area in 1776. Franciscan priest Francisco Dominguez and Sylvester Revel de Escalante traveled through parts of the Paiute territory, providing the first historical reference to the native people. These explorers were attempting to find the northern route between Santa Fe, New Mexico and Monterey, California. Their record indicates they did not come to Pipe Spring, but traveled about 6 miles south of the spring, known as the area of Bulrush Wash. These explorers provided much knowledge of the Great Basin region. They were later followed by excursions into the region by fur trappers, including Jedediah Smith, William Wolfskill in 1826, Ewing Young in 1830, and in 1849 the gold rush brought numbers of prospectors and others traveling through the territory. The pioneers from Nauvoo came to Utah heralding the exploration of this country. As you know, shortly after the pioneers entered Salt Lake Valley, Brigham Young began sending explorers to settle to the various parts of Utah to establish communities and places for the new arrivals to be settled. Major John Wesley Powell, a government surveyor, provided more details and descriptions of the area. The Paiute name for the Pipe Spring was Yellow Rock Spring or Yellow Rock Water. The story on the naming of Pipe Spring took place during one of the several trips by Jacob Hamlin on his mission to the Indians. On one of these stops, there were several men, including Jacob's brother, William Hamlin, or Bill Hamlin. Hamlin was an excellent marksmanship with a rifle. The story goes that they were discussing his ability, and someone said he could not shoot through a silk handkerchief suspended by the top corners at 50 paces. After failing several attempts, as the musket ball traveled so slow it would push the silk away and not go through it. Failing this, Will told one of the men with a pipe that he could shoot the bottom out of the bowl without breaking the sides. The pipe was laid on a rock near the spring, and Will promptly shot the bottom out, knocking the pipe into the spring. So goes the story of the naming of Pipe Spring. The establishment of settlements along the corridor from Brigham City, Utah to St. George was a result of the pioneering for which many of you probably have ancestors among these settlements. Areas in southern Utah were developed shortly after the first settlers arrived in Kanab in 1856. During the Indian War of 1865, many of the southern Utah settlements were abandoned from 1865 until 1870 at Brigham Young's direction. The first white man to claim Pipe Spring was James Montgomery Whitmore. After joining the church in Texas, Whitmore moved his family and brothers and sisters to Salt Lake City in 1857. He remained there with his family until 1861, when called to move to St. George. On April 13, 1863, Whitmore received a certificate for a 60-acre tract of land, which included Pipe Spring. On this tract, Whitmore, assisted by Robert McIntyre, established a ranch, constructed a small dugout for living quarters, fenced about 11 acres for cultivation, and set out 1,000 grapevines. Built corrals, planted peach, apple, and other fruit trees. And up until a few years ago, and I'm supposed still one of the grapevines and one of the apple trees still succeeded from the first planting. In early 1865, Navajo raiders began crossing the Colorado River, raiding settlements in southern Utah on the Arizona Strip. In December 1865, Navajos attacked the Utah Territorial Militia in Kanab, forcing the settlement to be abandoned. In January 1866, a party of Indians drove off a herd of sheep from the Whitmore Ranch. Whitmore and McIntyre set out to trail the raiders, leaving James Jr., Whitmore's 11-year-old son, in the dugout. When the men did not return, the boy headed on foot for William B. Maxwell's ranch at Short Creek, 25 miles to the west. He was intercepted by men on horseback, who then informed Maxwell of the situation. On January 11, 1866, word was received in St. George from Maxwell of the disappearance of the McIntyre and Whitmores. As there are no eyewitnesses to the killing, we do not know exactly what happened. However, a group of men led by Captain James Andrus searched and found the bodies of Whitmore and McIntyre. They also found a group of Paiute Indians who were in possession of Whitmore and McIntyre's clothes and other equipment. These Paiutes were killed thinking they were the ones that caused the problems. Later it was determined by Jacob Hamlin, that the Navajo raiding party had done the killing and traded the items to the Paiutes, who were then later killed in retribution. Later that same year, Captain Andrus with a group were directed to explore the area along the Colorado River from Buckskin Mountain or the Kaibab Mountain north to Green River. They passed through Pipe Spring on this trip. Due to the Indian problems, it was determined to establish a military supply point at Pipe Spring. Erastus Snow, not keeping up with my pictures, was given the responsibility. It was the first building constructed, and a garden of turnips, corn, and other items were planted in the area that Whitmore had their garden. With the problems the church was having with the government over polygamy questions, and government deciding that tithing was income for Brigham Young and was to be taxed. Because of this, it was determined in 1869 to move the cattle tithing herd from the Antelope Island in the Great Salt Lake as far from the railhead as possible, with Pipe Spring and this area around to be used for that purpose. Anson P. Windsor was given the call to manage the tithing herd in this area. During 1870, Brigham Young made a trip from St. George to Kanab, asking the area in Kanab to be reestablished. The church at this time had purchased the Whitmore property from Elizabeth Whitmore and established the Windsor Stock Growing Company headquartered at Pipe Spring. It was on this trip that Brigham Young planned to have the fort built over the spring for protection of travelers and people in the area. Anson P. Windsor was called to manage the herd. Anson sent his son to live in the dugout Whitmore had constructed and planted a garden. The ownership of Pipe Spring was then in Brigham Young's name. The construction of the fort, these are the two-level floor plans of the fort, was managed by Joseph Young and later by John R. Young, nephews of Brigham Young. The fort was built in 1870 to 1872. This fort was larger than any of the forts along the Mormon corridor from Brigham City to St. George. This was the case in case the church headquarters were to move from Salt Lake to Mexico. Pipe Spring would be used as a temporary church headquarters. The government had John W. Powell surveying the Colorado River drainage area at this time, and he used Pipe Spring area for supplies and support. He referred to the fort as a castle and called it Windsor Castle. This name has been used by several different groups thereafter and is still on the plaque on the side of the fort. As a sidelight to this, and important in the history of Pipe Spring, you'll remember that the conflict that was going on between the church and the United States government over the government of Utah Territory and the polygamy question. From the presentation paper by John May Peterson in March 2016, this was given in the church the church office building library as a church presentation that they used to do on Sunday evenings. He pointed out that the church presidency was considering moving the church to Mexico if the problems with the U.S. government became worse. Part of the reason Pipe Spring Fort was larger than any other was this would provide a place for church headquarters during the movement to Mexico. It also provided a very good situation for defense between the church and the government should a war come to pass. This is a picture looking to the west. It's about 10 miles to the west. This is one looking to the south, about 60 miles to the Colorado River. And this is a picture looking to the east to the Kaibab Mountain, about 30 miles. The Hurricane Fault was about 200-foot cliff to the west and provided barrier for moving equipment from St. George area toward Pipe Spring, and also the location of the fort provided coverage to the west, east, and south, should an army attempt to approach from those directions. The north was blocked by the mountains in southern Utah. Peterson also indicated that Brigham Young's directions, there were forts built under Brigham Young's directions, there were forts built all along what was called the Mormon Corridor from Salt Lake City to St. George. Of these forts, only Cove Fort and Pipe Spring remained standing. The forts were to provide protection to the Saints moving south and a deterrent to the government forces trying to follow. The church-owned Deseret Telegraph was extended to St. George, then on to Kanab, with the first message being sent in December 1871 from Pipe Spring. This would provide communication from the area if needed. Eliza Luella Stewart, a 16-year-old girl from Kanab, was the first telegraph operator. She later married David King Udall, who was the first president of the Mesa Arizona Temple, becoming the first matron. This was also the first telegraph in the state of Arizona. Back this to Pipe Springs, which was within the territory of Arizona. However, James Whitmore had received a certificate from the Pipe Spring claim from Washington County, Utah. During this time, Pipe Spring fell under the jurisdiction of 3 different counties in 2 different territories. From January 4th, 1856 to August 1st, 1864, it was under the jurisdiction of Washington County, Utah Territory. Kane County was formed in 1864, and Pipe Spring came under the Kane County, Utah Territory, where jurisdiction remained until 1883, when the Arizona Territory was formed with the establishment of the boundary between Utah and Arizona territories, put the fort in Arizona. In 1877, Windsor Castle Stock Growing Company was transferred to the Canaan Cooperative Cattle Company of St. George. This was headed by Erastus Snow, president of the St. George Stake. The ownership of Pipe Spring with the Windsor Castle Stock Growing Company remained with Brigham Young until his death in August 29, 1877. The ownership of Pipe Spring was transferred to John Taylor, president of the church, sometime in 1879, after the estate of Brigham Young had been settled. In 1879, the Canaan Cattle Company Superintendent James Andrus was appointed to take charge of the Windsor cattle herd, but resigned later that year. His assistant, Charles Pulsper, stayed at Pipe Spring in the winter of 1879. On December 17, 1879, the company hired James S. Emma to oversee the Andrus Spring, Shark Creek, and the Pipe Spring ranches. By 1880, the church management of Pipe Spring Ranch was to lease it to interested cattlemen who would use it as an investment and care for the church cattle. In 1881 or 82, Pipe Spring Ranch was leased to a Kanab resident, Joseph Guernsey Brown, who lived there until 1885, before Brown family moved from Pipe Spring. A French visitor named Albert de Sandier made a sketch of the fort and its setting. This is the oldest known picture of the site. In 1885, when the Browns moved, the church turned the management of the ranch and herd over to the United Order of Orderville, with Erastus Snow's son-in-law, Edward Woolley, Jr., placed in charge of Pipe Spring herd in late 1885. Between 1884 and 1893, with the enforcement of the Edmund Act For cohabitation, there were at various times 9 plural wives and their children taking refuge in Pipe Spring. If you're aware of this, being in Arizona, the federal agents were in Utah. Terry couldn't cross the state line or the territory line, and so the people that were in Arizona were safe from the marshals and that were after the polygamists. During the time Edward Woolley oversaw the fort and cattle, modifications were made on the fort at the insistence of his wife. Windows were cut in the south building and gates were removed from both ends of the fort, leaving it with better light and access. There was never a conflict with the Indians after the fort was constructed. These men were not totally isolated from the outside world, as a telephone was installed using the telegraph line in 1888. Following President Taylor's death in July 25, 1887, John W. Young formed a holding company called the Kaibab Cattle Company. This company took under its umbrella, the Pipe Spring Ranch, grazing herds at House Rock Valley, the Kaibab Mountain, and the Arizona Strip, and controlled all of the assets of the Canaan Cooperative Stock Company. The church, through the Kaibab Land and Cattle Company, continued operating the Pipe Spring cattle business in and around Pipe Spring. After President Taylor's death, Wilford Woodruff became the head of the church, which had ownership of Pipe Spring. In 1895, following President Woodruff's official declaration on polygamy, the church was able to sell property that had proven unprofitable. In mid-1895, the church sold Pipe Spring property to Benjamin F. Saunders, a rancher who dealt in both sheep and cattle and had ties in southern Utah, northern Arizona, dating back from about 1883 until his death in 1909. Even though he was not a member of the church, he got along well with the Latter-day Saints. He had wanted to buy Pipe Spring for many years. Benjamin F. Saunders held the property only briefly, selling it on December 2nd, 1895 to David John Bullock of Salt Lake City and Lehi W. Jones of Cedar City, Utah for $3,250. On May 24th, 1897, Bullock and Jones formed the Pipe Spring Cattle Company. At a meeting of the Pipe Spring Cattle Company on January 19th, 1901, a resolution was passed to sell the property to A.D. Finley. The final transfer of the title for Pipe Spring was executed November 3rd, 1902. Pipe Spring purchase was to include lumber, fencing, hay machinery, the stove, and furniture used on the ranch. The total price for the livestock from the ranch and Pipe Spring tract would have totaled a value of $31,000. On April 13, 1907, Finley formed the Pipe Spring Land and Livestock Company. During the Finley ownership, as well as that of the Bullock and Jones, the caretakers and ranch hands all lived in the fort. Finley sold the ranch to Jonathan Heaton and Sons Co-Partnership on January 2nd, 1909, with Finley carrying the mortgage for the amount promised in payment by Jonathan Heaton and Sons. He was to receive Pipe Spring Ranch with all improvements, water rights, appurtenances, as well as a parcel of land known as the Finley Lower Reservoir, along with improvements in water rights, privilege, and appurtenances. The price was $59,563.13, and I still wonder how they come up with 13 cents. Payable 1 year with interest. An interesting follow-up on this price and the story within the Heaton family indicates that one of Jonathan's sons disagreed with the number of animals to be included in the sale. He did not think there was that many animals on the range and insisted that they be counted. Because of this count, it is said to have the price went up to over $100,000 because there were a lot more animals than anybody had anticipated.
Smart move.
From the sale to Jonathan Heaton in 1909 until December 30, 1920, there seemed to be questions of ownership. My grandpa, Charles C. Heaton, as vice president of the Pipe Spring Land and Livestock Company, through the court actions, finally received a quitclaim deed from the A.D. Finley on December 30th, 1920. And here again comes some confusing. On December 18th, 1920, Pipe Spring Land and Livestock Company executed a quitclaim deed to my grandfather, Charles C. Heaton. The reason the two dates of this transaction are out of chronology is unknown. Also about this same time, Jonathan Heaton and Sons co-partnership was dissolved, and I have no record of how this dissolution was made and the holdings were divided. The history of Pipe Spring becoming a national monument begins in 1920 with Secretary of the Interior Mather visiting Pipe Spring. This visit was made in conjunction with the dedication of Zion National Park and took place on September 15, 1920. After the dedication at Zion, Mather wanted to visit the other national monuments in the area. Traveling from Zion to Grand Canyon using an old wagon road, they passed by Pipe Spring. They stopped for a visit and discussed with the Heatons about making it a national monument at that time. Not only were the Heatons receptive to the idea, they promised to furnish labor should the National Park Service decide to undertake a restoration. In June 1920, Mather wrote the Office of Indian Affairs and that he had found an interesting old homestead in the Kaibab Indian Reservation and wanted to acquire it for the park system. There's the outline there is the Kaibab Reservation with the monument being in the middle of it. Pipe Spring was located in the Indian Reservation, which has been established in 1907. However, cattlemen continued to run cattle on the reservation land as the Indians did not have cattle until many years later. Mather continued to return to Pipe Spring in the fall of 1821 in the company of the Union Pacific Railroad, a senator from Montana, and two other individuals with the intent of demonstrating the potentials for tourism in this part of the country. This is where the story of Pipe Spring and my family gets interesting. It seems that Mather's group left Zion early morning, traveling towards Grand Canyon. However, they got stuck in sand at Shark Creek for 4 hours. It was between 1:30 and 2 before they arrived at Pipe Spring. They were famished as they did not have any water or food with them. While they were looking around at the fort, Charles C. Heaton, my grandfather, and Randall Jones from Cedar City, who had been checking the cattle, came on horseback to the area. Mather asked my grandfather about the fort, and grandfather explained the history of the place. Somewhere in the discussion, somebody asked, "How close is there a place where we can get something to eat?" These fellows haven't had anything to eat since 6 o'clock this morning. Grandpa told them that you can go to Moccasin and I think my wife can fix you dinner. Grandpa then explained how to get to Moccasin, which was six or more miles by road. And he got on his horse and galloped the 4 miles north to home and had grandmother prepare a dinner for them by the time they arrived. These are other pictures of the fort. This was the west cabin, and at the time Mather was visiting there. Among Mather's comments about the dinner was that the tomatoes were the size of dinner plates. Mather thought that Pipe Spring would be a good place for a tourist stop on the road from Zion to Grand Canyon or Grand Canyon back to Zion. From this point on, all were in favor of making Pipe Spring a national monument. Secretary Mather's interest in making Pipe Spring a national monument continued. On January 18, 1922, Mather wrote Apostle George A. Smith and asked him to approach the Heatons about selling Pipe Spring. Mather asked Smith to negotiate a purchase price and to act as spokesman to raise the necessary funds. According to the church historian B.H. Keller, Mather was sympathetic to the church and fascinated by its history. He could also see the benefits of making it part of the Union Pacific Railroad tour package. Apostle Smith and President Heber J. Grant worked together to help Mather achieve this goal, but progress was very slow. Mather had asked church officials in 1922 to serve as intermediaries in determining the selling price by the Heaton family for Pipe Spring Ranch. Nearly a year and a half later, President Grant wrote to Mather to inform him that Charles C. Heaton had set a selling price of $5,000. The church promised to subscribe some money towards the purchase and would approach others for additional funds. President Grant wrote, and there's a quoted, says, "Perhaps my associates may consider allowing the church to subscribe for at least 10% toward the purchase of the property. Although it hardly seems in line for the church, which is a charitable institution, to be spending money to purchase property and make it a presentation to the United States government," end of quote. Thinking of the past history between the two. Mather was anxious to get the financing taken care of before he left Washington in the summer of 1923. So President Warren G. Harding could sign a proclamation establishing the monument. Mather, working with business people, congressmen, and others throughout southern Utah area, he stated that the non-Mormons had little interest in establishing a monument, as it was just an old outpost of the Mormon Church, and up to the Mormons to take care of it if the matter if they wished anything done. Meanwhile, Mather asked his assistants to draw up the proclamation, which was completed in May 23, 1923. Mather gave a draft to the Office of Indian Affairs, which 2 days later returned it, disapproving it for the lack of provision for the reservation of Kaibab Paiutes to use water from Pipe Spring. Mather inserted a statement to allow the Indians to use the water. The Indian Affairs gave approval on May 28th with the water use included. There are a lot of things going on at this time that could have interrupted the process, but Mather, pushing things, moved ahead. The proclamation to make Pipe Spring a national monument was transmitted to President Harding on May 29, 1923. The memorandum included the description of Pipe Spring and, quote, "As an early dwelling place, it was used for refuge from hostile Indians by early settlers. Pipe Spring was first settled in 1863, was the first telegraph station in Arizona. The spring offered the only water on the road between Hurricane, Utah and Fredonia, Arizona, a distance of 62 miles, which is a direct route from Zion Park, Utah to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, Arizona. It is an oasis in the desert land with an increasing motor travel between the two national parks It is highly desirable as an area to be established as a national monument," close quote. President Harding signed the proclamation establishing a national monument on May 31st, 1923, Presidential Proclamation number 1663. Details of the transfer of the property still had to be worked out. Even though Pipe Spring was declared a national monument, it was still owned by the Heaton family. Also, the Office of Indian Affairs still had their claim to the ownership of Pipe Spring. There were concerns by all parties as to who would take care of the property. Some wanted the Indian Affairs to take care of it. The Heatons didn't trust Dr. Edward Farrow, who was an Indian agent for the reservation at that time, because of his attitude toward the Mormons. Also, there was the concern in the statement put in for the water that the Indians would allow the reservation to use all of the water from the spring. Charles Heaton informed Washington that he would not sell Pipe Spring unless he had assurance that John White, his foreman, would be retained as caretaker and the water rights to be settled, as he had told them he had sold some of the water rights to the cattle ranchers, and that the sale had to be recognized prior to selling the property to the government. There were many conflicts concerning the transfer of Pipe Spring to the government for the National Monument. To resolve these concerns, the Indian Affairs, Park Service, Cattlemen's Association, and the Heaton family were involved. It took from 1921 until April 28, 1924 to resolve all the problems. The final selling price for the property was $4,000. Of this, the government never paid its $1,000, nor the church its $500 by the time the quitclaim deed was turned over to the National Park Service. And I remember my grandpa saying that the government stole the Pipe Spring from him because apparently he never got any money for it. With the completion of the ownership cleared and Pipe Spring National Monument under the direction of the Southwest National Monuments, headquartered in Coolidge, Arizona, with Superintendent Frank Pinkley in charge. In 1925, Superintendent Pinkley offered my father, Charles Leonard Heaton, catch up with my pictures, a job at $1 a month to take care and start the restoration of the fort building. In February 1926, Leonard, riding his horse, Snake, and his black dog with his bedroll, moved into the fort at Pipe Spring. He was authorized to build a service station and a lunch stand south of the ponds. The permit for this was also issued in 1925. Superintendent Pinkley also instructed Leonard to begin the restoration of the fort and said to use your own good judgment in the work. However, the first direction was to improve the monument was to clean up the area as it had been used for watering cattle and livestock over the years. Cattle would come from the desert in long lines for the water. My father married Edna Robertson of Alton, Utah on June 26, 1926, and moved into the fort where they lived until February 1936. While living there, 5 children were added to the family, myself the last person born in the fort. The move from the fort was necessitated by the continued restoration work, and during the Depression, the formation of the Civilian Conservation Corps, referred to as the CCC camps, and a camp to be constructed on the monument property. Due to conflicts with the Park Service, the CCC camp was moved in 1940. One building was left and remodeled as a home for our family to move into in October 1940. My father remained as contractor, caretaker, custodian, superintendent, or ranger for 37 years. retiring in 1963. During his years there, he rebuilt, directed, oversaw the reconstruction of the buildings and was responsible for collection of the many items of history that have been displayed in the fort. And that gets the end of my part here. I have a few more pictures. There's a picture taken on my 88th birthday in the room that I was born in. This is some pictures of the fort as it looks present day. This is the east building that has been reconstructed. If you remember back how bad it was in 1923. West building, this is the courtyard inside of the fort. This is the telegraph office in the fort, and as far as they know, they have the original telegraph key that was used when the Deseret Telegraph was established in that area. There's another room in the fort. Here's an aerial picture of the fort, current aerial picture, the fort with the new buildings and the entrance to the fort. And there, the entrance to the fort, the Paiute Indians have a building up there in the fort, the entrance, when you enter the fort, to take your money so you can go in and see and sell items to you.
Show us where the fort is exactly. Is it up to that?
The fort is right up on the north part there. You can see that line of the ledges coming around. And there's a walkway that comes around to that west building as they get the white line. Do you have a pointer?
Just right there.
Finger in your
Yeah, finger in there.
Oh, no, okay.
Where'd you get that? Thanks, somebody did so.
Have to go back.
Scoot away from it a little bit.
The fort is. I can't watch that to keep my finger in the place. The fort is in the top up edge right there. That's the fort right there. The ponds are right in front of it. This area down here is the residential and the place for the caretakers, the monument now. This is an orchard that was set up where they had, where Whitmore's had his first orchard through that area. And the grapevine that's still alive in this area, and the apple trees right up in this area.
Lowell, there's might want to tell everybody about the museum when you go in there. What's at the parking lot there?
The entrance to the fort is the Indians have their office right here.
Yeah, there's a really nice museum that you can go
Here
to.
have some Indian headquarter buildings for the Kaibab Indian Reservation.
So that one place is the parking lot then?
Yeah, right off the main road.
Right there.
And there's a visitor center and a museum.
This is a campground for the Indian reservation we have there. And the Park Service also has some office buildings, office space up there where they maintain items that were moved out of the fort. My biggest objection to go to the fort now is that all the stuff my dad collected. They said, "Oh, that's not pertinent to the situation at the time," and so they moved all of that out, and most of it out, and stored it in another climate-controlled building.
Hey Lowell, how far is it from Fredonia to there? It's about 30 miles or from Fredonia?
13 miles.
Oh, it's
Fredonia
13 miles.
to Pipe Spring. The road is down here. This road goes north. This is the direction my grandpa would have taken when he rode up to get dinner ready. The road to get to Moccasin from here went back to the east and then back up along a 2-mile wash, which made it 6 or 7 miles before you could get back up to Moccasin by road.
That